So I'm just going to open it up. We have this extraordinary group of panelists who have really, for the last couple of decades, been involved in how we actually think about language being an asset, and how do we actually change the educational paradigm in our schools for language to be an asset for all students. They're each going to talk about how they think of the approach to education for English learner students, how we might want to change that approach, and some programs and strategies that have actually really been effective at engaging English learner students and their parents. So I'm going to start with Patricia, and we will go on from there.
Okay. Well, I'm somewhat embarrassed to say, but it's been more than a couple decades, Anurima. Been doing this for a long time. And one of the things I'd like to put on the record, too, is Anurima is absolutely right about 5 million students. That's the data that you will get. The reality, however, is that 1 in 4 kids in the U.S. today is the child of immigrants. And immigrants speak their home languages at home. So that number, which is the official number, seriously underestimates the numbers of kids that we're really talking about who need attention. But I want to start by saying that I am troubled by simply by the way that we label them, English learners. They are labeled by what they don't have as opposed to what they do have. Mm-hmm. And these kids come to us with these tremendous linguistic and cultural assets, things that this country needs, things that we need to build on, both for the sake of the kids and the sake of the country. So I think we need to deal with that right off. We are very fortunate as well. My thing is like jumping around here. We're very fortunate as well that we have, overwhelmingly, these children speak one of the great world languages. And so this brings tremendous linguistic assets to the country. I think we have just taken a wrong turn in the way we educate these children. The holy grail of English learner education has become reclassification. Get them in and out of these programs as quickly as possible before they're stigmatized, as English learners. Why are we building programs for kids that we don't want them to be in? Why aren't we building programs for these children that build on their assets and that other children want to join them in, like dual language programs, bilingual programs? I think the classic example, actually, of this is the state of Arizona. Arizona reclassifies its English learners more rapidly than just about anybody, and it also is at the very bottom, 46th or 47th in the nation, in terms of these children's achievement. We need to be focusing on the kids' academic achievement above and beyond which language they are getting that achievement in. English comes, achievement gets lost if we pass up these opportunities to educate these children because we're so focused on English. Do I have any more time, or shall I stop here?
You can continue.
Okay. Let me just say what we do know from the research. We have some absolutely stellar research that's been done in the last few years, very high quality. And what it tells us is that those children who come from these immigrant homes and retain their home language because it's taught to them alongside of English, go to college at higher rates. If they're Latinos, they're going to go to 4-year colleges at higher rates. They're going to earn more out in the labor market once they leave college. And they have enormous cognitive advantages. They're actually, in a certain way, smarter than kids who are educated in only one language. So the bottom line is we've taken a wrong turn. We need to be educating these children in a way that builds on the assets that they have, and it will, in the end, do well for the kids. It'll do well for the society.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Crystal, and I'll start with that last point about building on the assets. And I think when we think about what we may need to be doing differently, in my head, so what we focus on mostly is on teachers and providing the best supports that teachers need in this space to really give the kind of education that we feel English learners deserve. But one of the primary things I think before we even dig into how is like really around our system and the mindset we have around English learners. Going back to your label, right? It is we can't have this deficit perspective in how it is. And I think when I talk about mindsets, it does come down to what instruction says and so forth. But I think a big part of that is just even what we expect English learners are able to do and what we believe about that, right? So one prime example, right, is when we're thinking about, one of the areas that we touch on is the high quality instructional materials and what those actually mean. And really this narrative around not pushing for English proficiency, which is a focus on many of them right now, and part of the reason why it's been a siloed approach, right? Well, go learn English here, whether it's the pull-out model, the push-in model, ESL separate from content. And that's part of the paradigm shift we're really pushing for, is that language and content cannot be taught separately anymore. It has to be simultaneous with content. And at the end of the day, like, they're kids, right? The whole purpose of why we're all here is to build a better education and an education that they deserve. And that is really with the focus on learning. And as Patricia just said, like, we know from research, if you focus on that learning and giving them the same access as every other kid in that grade level, English will come. But the learning has to be exciting, it has to be engaging, it has to be something that they want to be doing. And the truth is that's just not easy sometimes for teachers to understand how to do that. So as we thought about a lot of ways that we could really approach this is, teacher professional development and instructional materials. Whether we want to face it or not, those materials drive a lot of the content instruction in that classroom. And we really do feel it must be good and it must be engaging for ELs and it must be inclusive of their linguistic needs. Part of this, and I think too, is around the asset building, right? A big buzzword I think that has constantly been in the space, but when we think about materials, has been about cultural relevance. And we've gotten approached of, can you look at the authors in these texts and tell us like how we can make them more brown and black authors to be more culturally relevant? Yeah, but that's one part of cultural relevancy, right? Like, and responsiveness. Does what you're teaching and the way you teach it really build on the kids' assets? Are they seeing themselves in these stories and building them up to say, oh my gosh, look what I can bring to this learning. Look at my experiences. And I think just this general sense of like what everybody's life and learning should look like. What are we doing to bring that out of the students and say, you know what, you already come with extremely in-depth experiences that we need to know about and bring that out. And I think instructional materials that are educative and have those features for teachers to guide them and say, oh, when you're going through this complex text, this is a way you can pull out some of these things for English learners. And so we are really trying to be a help in that space. We really want to work with content providers out there that are looking to say, okay, English learners, as we said earlier, 1 in 4, as you said it at home, it's predicted to be 1 in 4 classrooms by 2025, I believe, are English learners in our classrooms. And so I just say for people here, if you're doing anything related to education and you're not doing anything related to English learners, I hope this is a wake-up call because 1 in 4 kids in these classrooms by 2020 will be there, and we do not want to be playing catch-up later. And so I think these are part of the things that we're trying to approach with instructional materials and PD, and I'll stop right there because I'm sure there's so much more I could say about that. But.
Thank you. And before we get to our last two panelists, I put some pads and pens around the room. If people have questions, we're going to leave some time for questions at the end. I would love for you to write them out. We will have them picked up, and I can actually have them already ready to go for the Q&A time. And I now will turn it over to Gloria.
Great, thank you. Gloria Corral, I'm with Parent Institute for Quality Education, and I think this question is really challenging. I think our perspective around two things. What is the role that we as educators play vis-a-vis a community that we serve? And I think that's really important because I think our system hasn't yet shifted to a different set of students and families that are now, certainly in California, but increasingly is the case across the country. And we really think about that as the way we think about families. And oftentimes, right, the metric that gets measured is third grade reading of a child, graduation rate of a child, and so on. And this isn't to minimize that, but I think we haven't yet taken the opportunity to challenge ourselves, especially in this context, to really think holistically about that child living in the context of a family, living in the context of a community. And I think the work that we do really highlights the importance of partnering with the parents who also themselves come with a rich set of assets that often get minimized or in some cases obscured. And so part of our challenge, I think, is to, on the one hand, highlight the students, of course, but you can't do that if you are negating the experience that made them be at school, right? If we don't see their parents, if we don't see their aunts and uncles, if we don't see their extended family, we're actually not seeing them, we're not validating them. And therefore, they're not turning to their families as the asset that many of us who were privileged enough, or many of you who are privileged enough to turn to your grandfather to tell stories, for somebody else to help you really make the connections between experience and learning. And so I think for us, what we bring to the table is expanding our definition of success to not make it exclusive to whether or not a child gets reclassified. We tell our parents, we understand why you're worried about reclassification. We really believe that. But that should not disempower you to ensure that you're talking to them in your native language and talk about the richness of the culture and the reasons behind why you are making the choices that you're making. And so, interestingly, or maybe not, because it seems pretty obvious to us, parents who are empowered to find who they are and how they share that connection with their children end up doing better. They graduate at higher rates, so almost 90% of kids that participate through our program, they graduate from high school. 70% of them go on to higher education. And what's our magic sauce? It's actually believing that families matter, that a parent is the single most important teacher, and that we need to meet parents where they are, but empower them to do what anybody who's a parent here wants for their child, which is to make that child's experience the best it can. And so we really bring that to the table. Let's expand the conversation and not look specifically or exclusively at the child without looking at the family and the community in which they live.
Great, thank you. I think I'd like to maybe take a different perspective. When you look at, I think, and Patricia mentioned that the U.S. education system has competing interests. You have a budget that's geared towards reclassification, and that budget disappears, and yet we are not, doing what we've been talking about here, which is looking at the assets. And so, any investors in the room, just think about using some of your capital and going out and investing in a company, and overnight saying, okay, everything that we invested in, we're not going to use. Well, that's not a very wise investment. We have tremendous amount of assets coming into our classroom. The diversity and culture and opportunity that we have to use that to make our country so much better. We have a tremendous opportunity. So at Imagine Learning, we were formed 15 years ago with the goal in mind of teaching language and celebrating language to the children of the world. Well, we first thought that we would go into the China market, but what we quickly realized was in the United States, there was plenty of opportunity and need to celebrate the language that our kids come to school with. I grew up in Salinas, California, and obviously my last name is not, I'm not from Mexico. I grew up in a very white household, but I grew up in a very interesting environment where my best friends in North Salinas High School, 85% Latino. And each one of my friends, they experience things that I never experienced. Their parents not wanting to come to their track events, their parents not feeling comfortable to engage in their learning opportunity. And as I got older and I moved to Chile for a few years, and I've always had that desire and goal to make opportunities for all of us, because language development is not just a language, if my native language is not English, it's an opportunity for all of us. And so we need to leverage those assets, and I think we're looking at it the wrong way in our education system today. We're saying, let's get them to English as quickly as possible. Whereas we're starting to see some of these states become a little wiser and, become a seal of biliteracy. And we need to focus on that and look at, if anyone's traveled to Europe, you see that it is such a diverse, trilingual countries, and that is who we need to become. So at Imagine Learning, our focus is language development and acquisition. We celebrate the home language. We help them become more literate in their home language, whether it's Spanish, and then we help them also perform. But this education system today, I think, is where we have some major challenges. You have a huge emphasis on performing on the tests in English, and yet that doesn't mean that a student that brings some other assets to the classroom can't provide much more rich experience for everybody else in the class.
Thank you. I want to say a couple things, which is I come to this as a civil rights lawyer, and the cases that we had around English learners were in every state in this country. And so we were looking at English learner populations in Oklahoma. We looked at a place like New York City, which has 160,000 English learner students in such a diverse number of languages. But for when I think about what we weren't doing properly, right, which is we also had a focus on whether or not students were learning English in the reclassification process, and we didn't look at the ways in which the educational resources that were available for students, when we think about how we should be educating it, is what is the needs of the learners, and how is it that we make sure that academic success is the focus, and the resources that are in classrooms, and this is where I think there's a tremendous opportunity here, which is the technologies, the ways in which you're engaging now can really be a place where we can have linguistically accessible, engaging, whether it be through technology or otherwise, learning for kids. And I think that that's the way in which we should be thinking about this area of our work, which is how do we make sure that we not only are thinking about the ways in which we've all sort of pointed out the problems, which is reclassification or learning English, but how do we actually just think about the academic experience being one that is as rich as possible for kids to whatever language they're speaking. So with that, I want to go back. I think there's a couple of different programs and strategies that you have all been able to see that have been very effective for students. And I want to start with Patricia because I want her to talk about dual language programs, and in particular some of the ways in which dual language programs have been effective at addressing long-term problems in our education system, like segregation, the ways in which we've seen opportunity really, frankly, atomized for kids in all over the country, and this is a way in which we can actually maybe address some of those problems.
Yeah, we're very hopeful about that. The fact of the matter is that English learners, or the children of immigrants, tend to be among the most segregated kids in our society. They are segregated into communities that are oftentimes so far off of the mainstream that they don't get the messages that everybody in the mainstream gets. It's really critical that these parents, and of course, I'll just say I just love PIQE, so I'm so happy that Gloria is here. That parents need to know the information they need to know that they're not going to get any other way if they are in these segregated communities. So one of the things that we've seen as a very hopeful possibility is the dual language programs that are sprouting up all over the country. English-speaking parents are willing to cart their kids across district lines, across the district, from here to wherever, in order to get their children into these programs, because these parents, middle class, upper middle class, well-educated, know the research. They know that these kids are going to outperform the other kids who have only one language. So these dual language programs that require a 50-50 kind of enrollment, 50% of children who come to the classroom with a native language other than English, and 50% of children who come to the classroom speaking English. This is one of the great opportunities we have in our society to actually desegregate our schools. And it needs to include all groups. This should not just be Spanish speakers and English speakers. I mean, we really need to think creatively about how we use this as a tool to bring all groups together in a more desegregated setting. So at the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, we have really been researching this area and pushing on this model as something that can benefit so many young people in our country.
Thank you. Would the rest of you like to talk about some of the programs and strategies that you think that have been really effective, and ones that those in the room may not know about, may be missing, that we should really sort of try and make sure we're focusing and investing in?
Sure. I think that one of the ways in which we, in our 30-plus year history, it's really taking parents, and it seems so straightforward, but we actually, perfected, if not, we've evolved and really understood that we need to meet parents and where they are, recognizing that the strategies that work are twofold. One, it has to be coming from a place of respect and sort of authentic recognition. So what that means is folks that work with parents are themselves parent graduates from the program, because now they have a model. This person looks exactly like me.
Lives in my neighborhood.
And now their child is in college. Now they've gone on to Harvard Business School, or so that's the first aspect, and I think understanding the power of that is critical. And then the other, I would argue, is, again, just based on our research, is so understanding respect, but the other, I think, is enabling them to create a community of learners, because oftentimes they themselves may not have been successful in their own learning. And so our model, what it shows is that you are given strategies, you can choose one or two strategies, you practice those strategies at home, and then you come back with a group of similarly minded parents and you interact and you learn from one another. And the empowerment that comes through that cycle of inquiry, because really that's what we call it in education, right? That's what kids do, it's the cycle of inquiry, but using that in our model with parents and validating that experience makes them empowered then to then go out and actually have the skill sets that they need to, things that you and I might take for granted, actually have a worthwhile conversation with their teacher about what standards are, where their child is performing and why, or to understand the difference between a counselor and a principal. Why do I care? What do they do? And how are they going to benefit my child and our community? And so for us, it's really understanding those two pillars of kind of cultural and linguistic relevant pedagogy is what I would, and bringing that to scale. And then really understanding that this skill set of becoming active learners are things that can happen in small and big ways. And I would say, and the way that we would ask those of you thinking about this space is then how do we ensure that technology is embedded in that? Because I see that as really kind of the big exponential factor, but we have the expertise and we have the knowledge because it matters, and we have years of research that shows this, and now it's how do we take it to scale. And so happy to talk with folks about that, but I think these are the two paramount pieces that really make a difference for our communities.
Great.
Go ahead, Crystal.
I was going to jump on that last point and about the research. I mean, this is the exciting part about this work, is that we have research to build from. A lot of the research that you've done, Patricia, which we're very grateful for, but we know that what works, and I think part of what we've done at the English Learner Success Forum is that we've looked at all the research out there. The question we always get is like, we know what the research says, but how do we do that in a day-to-day classroom lessons? And so that's what we've tried to do. We have a framework we have for ELA and for math of what are the most critical aspects of what we know works in English language development, and how does it look in content area instruction? How does it look for literacy? How does it look for mathematics? So that's one part of it, right? But the other part of it that we really pushed on is the fact that we have tremendous assets in our own communities So educators that have been doing this for decades, we've got researchers that have been engaged in this for decades as well, and leaders, district leaders, right, that have experienced success of what does this actually look like when you put it into reality. So what we've done is we've recruited over 40 educators and researchers from across the country to work with us to therefore go out and provide some of this feedback and these cycles of feedback with providers of content, of curriculum, and also professional development. People want to know, what does this look like? So I think one of the things that we've really got to encourage to do is, we know what the research says, we have people that know what it looks like in practice. Find those people, right? I think one of the frustrating things, a personal anecdote in my work, I was doing national grant making for the last, previous 4 years to this, and going to organizations that are doing great work in education. And I started my career as a bilingual teacher, so of course I'd ask, so what are you doing for English learners? And I always got two responses. We're leaving that to the L experts, or we're gonna figure it out first, what to do with gen ed kids, and then we'll figure out L's later. That cannot be what we're functioning off right now in our system. Over the last 20 years, a report by the Economic Policy Institute in 2017 came out that English learners, if you look at the achievement gap, right, we've seen a narrow gap between students of color and white students. Now, when you look and narrow it down on the research, the two groups that we have not seen any narrowing of the gap, or in some years it's gotten worse, has been between Hispanic English learners and Asian English learners. Now, that is not any fault except our own as a system to not understand what to do better for these students, right? And so I think we've got to be innovative in the sense of we can't be in our own lanes, right? Like, that's part of why the L Success Forum got started, is we want to be a source of support for people that really want to say, I don't know how to do this, I don't know where to go. We want to be that place where hopefully they can find some resources and some actually trained, experienced folks that can be a guidance of support.
Right before you jump in, if people have questions, if you want to just raise your hands, and if there aren't, we can take some of them. So if people have questions, please raise your hands, and we'll bring those up. And Jeremy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I really like what's been said. I think this is a complex opportunity for us, and it can't be done in isolation. I mean, companies like ours that have been around for 15 years, focused on great quality, high quality instruction for language development and acquisition, are great, and working with groups like the L Success Forum, but there are groups like the Council of Great City Schools and others that have come out with frameworks for mathematic instruction. We're currently working with the Gates Foundation in helping middle school math for English learners, right, and in helping parent engagement there. The council just did a project where they wanted high quality materials created for math. Well, they've done similar things for other areas. So materials, yes, and we need to continue to improve and realize that there's assets we can leverage and continue to do better. But there are also many organizations like Gloria's, and there's an organization in Utah called Latinos in Action. That is a group that I see tremendous opportunity with groups like that. Right?
Thank you.
And what Latinos in Action does is they pair high school students, Latinos, with elementary school students and help them to empower and foster a mentorship. Well, those students later become leaders in their school and go on. That program has started to spread throughout the country. Those are things that we need to look at systemically to say, how can we make a difference? It can't be Imagine Learning, an ed tech company in isolation. It has to be partnerships to make sure that our Patricia was talking about dual immersion. Utah, this small little state, as you well know,
Number one in the country.
Number one in the country with dual immersion, because and I think he's here, Senator Stevenson, was the one that championed the cause. It's $97 a student a year, and yet we have 8,000 students entering first grade every year learning to be biliterate and bicultural, and it's not just a one-way immersion, it's two-way immersion. And these students are exiting. I have my neighbor across the street is from Vietnam. His kids have been attending a Spanish dual immersion program, and they're trilingual, and one's in high school now, and he is just absolutely way more fluent than I am. And those are the types of things that we should be looking at to transform, the way that we do things. But it's all about partnerships and truly talking about these issues. Our focus is pretty focused on English language arts and math and helping with language development and acquisition. That's what we do at Imagine Learning. But we also recognize that we can't do it in isolation. We need to work with, and we have been working with, people like Crystal and I think, parent organizations. It's critical. What happens in that area around parents and the dynamics that happen when parents don't speak the language, there's a lot of research around it, that it creates somewhat of an awkward situation for students to have to translate for their parents. So what does that do? It creates shame for the student, and the parents don't want to enter the schools.
And the parents
And
lose authority.
it's actually against the law too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it should not happen, but it does. Right?
So let me, I think there's a theme here, and I just wanted to add a couple of different categories to it, which is there's a lot of conversation, there are a lot of different examples here about platforms to engage parents, platforms to engage students, personalized learning platforms. There are conversations happening about social emotional learning. In any of those contexts, I think part of what we're trying to say is it's critically important that you're thinking about the linguistic diversity of the students that you're serving, and how do you actually have that be something that is built in and designed in any product or service that you're providing, and not something that is sort of put into the box of this is for English learners, this is for for general education students, whatever that means in America today, and that we're very intentional about who it is that we're trying to serve and how best to do that. And so I have a question here. If there are other ones, please again put up your hand, and we're happy to grab them from you. One of the questions is to Jeremy, and I think this is a question across the board, which is how do we really think about accessibility and affordability of the kinds of services and products that are being provided, and how to make them sort of accessible to a range of school districts when we know all the different ways in which resources are constrained right now.
Yeah, I mean, so you have different funding sources, and Title III is the main funding source for English learners. 720 million roughly, hasn't increased in many years. In fact, it's been stagnant. You have Title I, which is a very big budget, and yet you have roughly 20% of the students that are English learners. That there's 25 million, Title I students and 5 million English learners. Yet the multiple of Title I dollars is dramatically more significant. So there's a little inequity in both funding and resources. That has to be addressed. That's just something that. But when you are in this resource-constrained environment, how can you make a difference? So I think, programs, like what Gloria has, and coming in and working with the district, partnerships like ours, we have millions of students using our programs around the country, and it's possible. It's just prioritization. I also think that school districts. We work with many of the largest districts in the country. Many of them, English, EL departments or ESL, depending on the state, wherever you are, is typically a director level role that doesn't sit on the cabinet, that doesn't, operate. Yet it's at least 10% of the population, and in many districts around the country, way more, and yet they're not getting the attention. So I think we should challenge the school district leaders to step up to the plate and put leadership in place, because the strategic plans have to be there to say it's not just in isolation. Frankly, if you just want to get Imagine Learning by itself, we're not going to solve your opportunities that you're trying to look at, right? It's got to be a systemic approach, and in the end, this is all about helping children succeed achieve their maximum potential. So funding is a challenge, but there are great opportunities to put programs in place. The challenge is how do you educate districts so that there's a process to do that.
Jeremy, you noted that in Utah, and Utah is a state that is especially good at being frugal about its spending, $97 a student is really a drop in the bucket.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's something that pretty much everybody can come up with. And in states like California, and other states are moving in this direction as well, the local control funding formula, the districts that have English learners get additional funding for precisely that. Money is being spent now for these kids.
Yeah.
I would argue it's not being spent in the way that we ought to be spending it.
That's right.
Right. Utah is the 50th in the country when it comes to per pupil spending.
Right.
Yet they have policy. As much as people might look at Utah and say, no, they're not progressive.
It's scarcity leads to innovation, right? Like that's exactly
they
it.
have been on the National Report Card for Technology. I mean, as an A grade, and they are doing things to empower districts to be able to have great resources. So they have a statewide initiative that was run through the State Office of Education for English learners, providing resources there. And that's a way to get economies of scale. So districts and states should be more deliberate and intentional about how do we maximize what we're doing. $97 when in a state of Utah, $6,500 per student. Massachusetts, $18,000 a student. $97 to help alter the trajectory or provide confidence to a student, it definitely is worth it.
I was also going to just mention that piece on the demand side of things with districts and demanding more, and I think we're going to start to see a lot more of that demand building from districts and states as particularly now with ESSA in place, and schools and districts are going to be getting flagged for some outcomes of their English learners in their districts, and now going to come back and say, oh my gosh, what do we do? And so I think one of the things that we've been also doing is educating districts and states across the country about holding that bar high, about what does educating the whole learner, like if you really care about all students and you're not talking about L's, one, that's a problem, but two, I think you mentioned this example earlier that I think one of the biggest school districts in our country, LAUSD, decided collectively they were on this onset of adopting new materials for 6th through 8th grade math, right? Not a topic of English learners, but it was 6-8 math, and they came together and said, okay, we're not going to purchase any of these materials unless they do these things for English learners, because they're a large percentage of our demographic. Lots of publishers obviously applied to the RFP. I think it was over 60 of them. But they held that bar high, and that was coming from the district. And they knew exactly what they needed to put in place for their L's. And guess what? People went up to the bar and they made it happen. When people say, oh my goodness, we didn't have any materials out there, guess what? Now 3, including you guys, they made it to the top. And now they're, now these students will have an integrated approach for mathematics where that's not just a whole different, aspect of it. So I think part of what we're also advocating for is that L's can no longer be an afterthought in anything that we're doing. It's just, that's the state that we're changing to, and it needs to be part of the conversation.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have a couple seconds left. If there's anything else, and I know you might have had some things you wanted to say, and I just want to give you the opportunity.
Well, thank you. I apologize. But I do think that this issue around resources, I think I want us to think about families as a resource. And I think, I would really challenge us to think about materials and all those things which are critically important, teacher training, all these things are critically important. I think when we start seeing families as an asset, this is what happens when children get home. And how do we support parents and grandparents and extended family that are home to actually be empowered to support the achievement goals that are set for families by honoring where they come from and the experiences that those families provide. I think $97, $100, $2,000, whatever the amount is going to grow exponentially. And so I really want us to think about that, I think, perhaps in a topsy-turvy way, by saying that, it's everybody knows this. You invest, every dollar invested in early learning yields $7. So imagine every dollar spent on a parent that has a child only triples that. So I think it's important to think about
I think
that.
I would just like to add one thing to that, Gloria, that we need to recall that these children are the children of immigrants,
Yes.
which almost by definition means the parents didn't go through the school system here. They don't know how it operates. They don't know what's expected.
right.
And that's what I think is very powerful that you do, is you put that information in parents' hands so that they can help guide their kids.
Thank you all.
Thank you.